የተከበራችሁ ተመልካቾቻችን በዛሬው የቤተክርስቲያን በተልዕኮ ላይ የተሰኘው ፕሮግራማችን እዚህ ፊታችን የሚገኙት ክቡር አባ አውግስጢን በትውልድ ኮሪያዊ እንደዚሁም በአገልግሎት ደግሞ በአሁኑ ሰዓት በቅድስት መንበር በሮም የሚሰሩ አባት በቤተክርስቲያን ተልዕኮ ዙሪያ ላይ አንዳንድ ጥያቄዎችን በመጠየቅ ከሳቸው ጋራ ውይይት የምናደርግ ይሆናል እና በዚህ ፕሮግራም እሳቸውን አስቀድሜ በማስተዋወቅ ከዚያ በኋላ ደግሞ ስለ ቤተክርስቲያን ተልዕኮ አስመልክቶ በተለያዩ ጥያቄዎች አማካይነት ውይይት ከሳቸው ጋራ እናደርጋለን። Dear Father Augustine, we are very grateful for your presence here, for accepting our invitation for an interview with you during your visit here in Ethiopia. I would like to ask you first to introduce yourself to our viewers of Catholic television, and then we will proceed with a few questions concerning the mission of the church and about your priestly ministry, but also the relationship between Ethiopia and Korea. We have a unique relationship as historically Ethiopians supported in the situation of Korea. But let us start first introducing yourself before getting into the main parts of the interview.
Thank you, Father. Thank you for having me among you, Father Augustine Han. My surname is Han, and I'm from South Korea. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Daejeon. Daejeon is at the center of South Korea. It's a metropolitan city, and it takes about an hour to get to Daejeon from Seoul if you ride on a fast train. And it has been already 8 years that I served the Holy Catholic Church in the heart of the church in the Vatican. And from 2015 September, from the September of 2015, I worked in the dicastery for evangelization, and since I was one of the few Asian officials of the dicastery, I was asked to be charged of office of desk officer of the church in Asia, for example, Japan, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and 7 vicariates of the Philippines, and all the Central Asian countries. It has been a really blessing to serve the church near the Holy Father, Pope Francis, because working in the Holy See, I could sense the universality of the church, and I could have a chance to talk with so many really holy people, and people, priests and sisters, totally dedicated to the mission of evangelization with all costs, really with all costs. So if Holy Spirit will guide me, I'd like to, during this interview, share my experiences and what I have learned in the dicastery serving the church in Vatican, in the Holy See.
Thank you, Father. You started with from where you are coming from, your diocese, but can you give us a little bit insight into the situation of the church in Korea? The Catholic Church is universal, as you well mentioned, and in Korea, how many dioceses do you have? For example, how many priests in your diocese, but also in other dioceses? And a little bit to share about the church in Korea.
First of all, I'd like to talk about the long history of the church in Ethiopia. I have to say that this is a part of my vacation. I didn't expect this coming. But anyway, I'll do my best. That in Ethiopia, I visited so many churches and so many social institutes. And in visiting those churches and institutes, I could realize that the church in Ethiopia has a very long story that goes up to the period of apostles. Yes. But unlike the church in Ethiopia, church in Korea has a relatively short history. The church in Korea, bishops and priests and the faithful people of God in Korea, we consider the day one of the church in Korea was one of the days of 1784, in which there was a first baptism of the Korean in Beijing now. This beginning of the history of church in Korea is a little bit peculiar because unlike other countries, some Korean scholars who were mostly Confucianism scholars, and they studied so many books that they imported from Beijing. And among those books, there were books related to Catholicism, especially those books written by Mateo Ricci, Jesuit missionary. Yes. And they wrote the book of the truth about the heaven and earth, written by Mateo Ricci. And they were so amazed by the truthfulness of the teaching. Although they had no chance to meet any priest, any bishop, any missionary, foreign missionary, or any kind of missionary, not at all. They just read the book and they were amazed. They were fascinated by the content of the book, and they had a discussion, and they decided, this group of scholars, they decided that we need to send someone to Beijing so that he can receive the first baptism in Beijing, and he will be able to give us baptism, because in the extraordinary condition and situation, baptism can be administrated also by the hands of lay people. Yes. So Peter Lee, he was the first one who went to Beijing, and he faithfully took the course of catechism course in Beijing, and he received the first baptism. And he came back to Korea. He baptized everyone he encountered, because he has a special kind of grace that he could persuade everyone to the Catholic faith. And Catholic faith was kind of a dynamite in the society of dynasty at that time. And eventually Peter Lee testified his faith with his blood. He is a martyr. And from then on, Catholic faith spread through and through in the country of the dynasty in the Korean peninsula. And unfortunately, the king and the royal family decided to give hard time to the church, because the church's doctrine could not go with the doctrine of the Confucianism at the time. For example, man and woman are equal. Like, there is no such a thing like noble person and servant. We are all children of God. This kind of teaching could not be accepted during the feudal dynasty society, because it is kind of upside down of the social system. So there came a very harsh persecution for more than 140 years. And we are not sure about the exact number of martyrs, because when they executed the martyrs of the low class, like class of the servant or class of slaves, they didn't leave a lot of records about them. There was a very cruel execution, just without any documental process or tribunal process. So at least we believe that we have 50,000 martyrs, at least. And at best, to the maximum, Some scholars, they believe that we have 200,000 martyrs, but only God knows. Anyway, when the government executed some noble person, some noble people, government left some documental proofs about their sanctity and their testimony. So we have 103 saint martyrs. They are all martyrs, saints, and 124 blessed. They are also martyrs. And in the last years of 19th century, because of the introduction of the diplomatic relationship between the United States and that dynasty at that time, and the diplomatic relationship between France and the Korean dynasty, the freedom of religion was finally realized in Korea. But we had another kind of hard time during the Korean War. During the Korean War, maybe some of you maybe have some knowledge about this. People call it, it was mini Third World War. Yeah, most of the countries in the world were involved in this war, and Korea was totally devastated because of the 3 years war. It was not just a civil war, because so many countries were involved after the Second World War. During the Korean War, we have the church in Korea could see the birth of many other martyrs, because the communist regime, they killed a lot of priests and sisters during the war, because they thought that religion is something really bad for the people. And we know that it is contrary, but at the time the communists thought in that way. And I can talk about the contribution of Ethiopia to the history of Korea in relation to the Korean War. I'd like to talk about it also, because, as you know, during the Korean War, which was broken in June 25th, 1950, Ethiopia was one and only country who decided to send military troops in favor of South Korea, Republic of Korea, which was only regime authorized by the United Nations at the time. So the last emperor, what was his name?
Haile Selassie.
Yeah, last emperor of Ethiopia. The name sounds familiar to me, but I don't want to make mistake in my pronunciation. The last emperor decided to send Kanyu battalion to South Korea in order to protect the freedom of people in Korea. And this morning I did some research about the number, because I knew that they were lion-like warriors. But I have the number here, that in 3 years of wartime, Ethiopia sent 6,037 soldiers, and they fought in 253 battles, and no defeat, all victories. 253 battles. 122 died during the battles, and 536 injured. But there has been no captivity. This is amazing. So they were really brave soldiers, and they are remembered by the Korean people as lion-like warriors, because there was no defeat. And even after the war, some of them remained in Korea in order to care the war orphans.
War orphans.
Yeah, war orphans. And because after 3 years of war, we unfortunately, they left a lot of orphans, and Ethiopian soldiers, with their salary they received, they opened some orphanages in Korea here and there, and they until the first years of 1960, if I'm not wrong, and they ran orphanages in Korea for those poor boys and girls. And So still we have this very grateful memory. I believe most of the Koreans know about this historical fact, and most of the Korean people, we hold this very grateful memory to the contribution and sacrifice of Ethiopian soldiers in favor of the people in South Korea. So yesterday, with Father Petros, we had a honor to be received by the Korean ambassador in Addis Ababa. Yeah, we had a lunch together, and he told me, Mr. Kang, ambassador, told me that Korea is forever grateful for the sacrifice of the Ethiopian people. So, as a sign of this gratefulness, Korean government every year send almost, how much was that exactly? 150 millions of ODA money, right? Overseas Development Assistance money, only for Ethiopia. Yeah. This is the highest portion of ODA contribution among the countries in Africa. And Korean government will continue to contribute as much as they can for the development, human development and social development of Ethiopian society, because we have this holy duty to express our gratitude to our brother country and brother people, Ethiopia.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is very interesting to hear from you as a young Korean citizen, a priest, concerning the history, the participation of the Ethiopian soldiers, of course, under the UN command. They have been serving there for the liberation of your country and your people, for freedom. So it's interesting to know that many Koreans are aware of this. It is not very far, 1951 to 1953, the war, but after that also the Ethiopians remained there to serve until 1965 even. They have been there assisting with the humanitarian activities. I would like to ask you about the church currently, the current situation of the church. How many dioceses are there in Korea, and how the church functions? You know, the church is universal, and our viewers are interested also to know the ministry of the Catholic Church in Asia, but particularly in your country.
While I was talking about the history of the church in Korea, I shifted so naturally from the talking about the history of the church in Korea to the contribution and the friendship between Ethiopia and Korea. About the friendship, I need to refer also the fact that Ethiopia is one and only country in Africa where there is direct flight between Addis Ababa and Seoul. So we are even physically so near to each other, so close to each other. So after the war, the Catholic Church in Korea tried to carry out his mission of evangelization, although it was the church members were minor in the society. After the war, if my memory serves me right, we have only 2% of the Korean population at the time were Catholics after the war. So I'm talking about late 50s. And from late 50s and 60s, the Republic of Korea, which is South Korea, tried their best to boost their economy. Because now North Korea, people know that people in the North Korea, they are undergoing a very hard time because of the economic difficulties. But until the last few years of 60s, North Korea was richer than South Korea. Can you imagine? So South Korean government's number one goal was to boost its economy. So, and economy took off by the help of many countries. For example, United States, even Japan wanted to contribute a little bit to the economic development of South Korea, because South Korea was considered as the first line country against the communism. And physically, geopolitically, it was true, because South Korea shared the frontier with North Korea still now. So economically, we could see some success, but politically, it was not easy, because we had more than 3 decades of dictatorship. The first president, Lee Seung-man, wanted to modify the constitution to continue his regime, and there was a very strong protest from students, so he had to flee from Korea. And the second president, Park Chung-hee, he was from his background, he was a soldier, and he wanted to govern the country for many years. Also, he wanted to modify the constitution. And after, and Park Chung-hee, poor person, was killed by one of the most close friends, assassinated by one of the most close friends. And after Park Chung-hee, there was Chun Doo-han. He also slaughtered a lot of protesters, young Korean citizens, in order to secure his regime. So we had more than 3 decades of very difficult time from the political point of view. And during this time, as you can imagine, human rights were so frequently violated, and people wanted to find a point of reference to which they could lean on, like religious authority or moral authority. They wanted to find real, trustable religious or spiritual or moral authority. And during this hard time, the Catholic Church, I believe, successfully, thanks to the grace of the Lord, carry out this mission of being presented to the people as an authority, trustable morally, religiously, and spiritually. So I'd like to talk about the first ever Cardinal Stephan Kim, of which the process for his canonization is open. And he was a wonderful person. And he was so humble, and he always identified him as a friend of the poor. And when there was a very harsh persecution against the students who cried out for the obtainment of democracy, Cardinal Stephan Kim always with those students and protected them. He protected them. So it was kind of a very peculiarity of the evangelization service that we have seen in Korea in the modern history, contemporary history. And thanks to the contribution and thanks to this wonderful figure of Cardinal Kim and his collaborators for sure, after the war we had only 2% of population as Catholic, but when in the first years of 2000, in the first years of 21st centuries, we could see the number of the population of Catholic Christians in Korea about 11%. So we have a little more than this. I hope this is the most updated statistics, but we have about a little bit more than 5 million of Catholics in Korea in 16 dioceses. In Korea, we have only Latin Rite, and those Christians are living in 16 different dioceses, and among these 16, 3 are archdioceses: Seoul, Daegu, Gwangju. These are 3 archdioceses, and we have 1 military ordinate, because still technically the war between North Korea and South Korea is not over. Unfortunately, we had no chance to sign the peace treaty. So Korean boys, if they are physically okay, still they have to go to obligatory military service for 18 months. Me, myself, although I was a seminarian, I had to serve the country as a soldier for 2 years. But now the government gave some kind of deduction of the time of the service. For 18 the months now. 18 months now. So this is a short story about the history of Korea, and since the church in Korea was benefited very much from the sacrifices of missionaries as well, especially French missionaries and German missionaries. Now, as we have good number of priests and sisters, last year I remember that I had a chance to read the statistics about the missionary status of the church in South Korea. And last year we have sent more than 1,000 missionaries to the world. And Latin America, in North America as well, and ironically even in Europe, because as you know, in Europe there is a serious problem of lack of priests and sisters, and we were able to, church in Korea was able to send more than 1,000 missionaries. And in Africa, I heard some days ago from a sister Helen, who are serving Ethiopian people in Awasa. She told me that in Ethiopia there are, in African continent, there are almost 100 Korean missionaries here and there, mostly in South Africa. And in Ethiopia, unfortunately, there is no Korean priest, but 5 Korean sisters, serving the local church in Ethiopia.
Yes, we are happy with these 5 sisters who are working with the church here in different congregations for the local church, and we do hope that Korean priests maybe will come in the future to work here in the Catholic Church in Ethiopia. So this is what I wanted to hear from you, the situation, how the church in Korea succeeded, to be from 2% to 11% in those years. It is amazing how the grace of God is working, and so many missionaries now be able to send to other countries, and also locally there are many priests who serve the church. In some of the dioceses you mentioned that 1,000 priests, and then in your own diocese, how many priests do you have?
In my diocese of Daejeon, we have recently we could see the number of 400.
Only diocesan priests?
In a diocese as diocesan priests, we have more than 400 priests.
And in the Archdiocese of Seoul?
If I'm not wrong, more or less 1,000.
I see. So it's a big number of diocesan priests you have, and many parishes, and so it's a blessing. The church is very dynamic, and we congratulate you also with this. Of course, the church is universal, and you are sending missionaries. You met also recently the Cardinal Brane Jesus, His Eminence. He was also mentioning that as well, that the church in Ethiopia is welcoming also missionaries to work here. We have a big country with a big mission, with our various dioceses here, Oriental Rite, but also Latin Rite dioceses. They work here to enhance the mission of the church. So this relationship can be strengthened in the near future, hopefully.
Yeah, I very much hope so too. In order to promote the collaboration, one thing about which I am so firmly convinced is that we need to prioritize the human communication, human resources, communication of human resources, or exchange of human resources. From that, all other kinds of collaboration can naturally stem from.
Yes.
Yeah. So next time, in the last few days of August, I will go to Korea for a week. Unfortunately, tonight I have to leave Ethiopia. Maybe tomorrow I'll be in Europe again. But in the last few days of this month, I will go to Korea for a week. And I set some appointments of meeting with bishops. And in those meetings, I'd like to tell them what I have experienced and seen in this beloved country, and sharing those experiences, I'd like to convey the invitation of the cardinal and of bishops in Ethiopia that they hope to receive Korean priests for the church in Ethiopia. There are lots of missions to be carried out in this country. So, yeah, I will do my best to convey the wish and the invitation of the church in Ethiopia to bishops in Korea.
መጀመሪያውን ክፍል በዚህ እናጠናቅቃለን። እግዚአብሔር አምላክ አገልግሎታችንን ሁሉ ይባርክ። የቤተክርስቲያን ተልእኮ ደግሞ በዓለም አቀፍ የሚሰጠውን የወንጌል አገልግሎት እግዚአብሔር አምላካችን ይባርክልን።